Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a word we all think we know, violence. But what if I told you that our common understanding of it barely scratches the surface? We're about to peel back the layers and uncover the kind of harm that's often hiding in plain sight.
No, really, just take a second to think about it. What's the very first image that pops into your head? If you're like most people, it's probably something physical, right? A punch, a crime, maybe a scene from a war. And look, you're not wrong, but you might not be seeing the whole picture.
All right, so let's start with the official definition from the World Health Organization. This is our baseline, and it's a pretty good one. It's broad, and it rightly includes things like psychological harm and deprivation. For a long time, this has been the foundation for how we talk about violence. But as we're about to find out, even this really comprehensive definition has its blind spots.
So here's the big question. What if this definition, as useful as it is, actually narrows our vision? What if it's unintentionally stopping us from seeing the full, complicated way that harm actually works in our world?
This slide right here gets to the absolute heart of it. On one side, you have that minimalist view, the stuff we all thought of first, kicking, hitting, direct physical stuff. But on the other side, you have the comprehensive view, and this is where things get interesting because it includes the systems behind the physical harm, things like poverty, hunger, social exclusion. These are invisible forces that cause incredible suffering, but you can't point to a single person who threw the punch. And that leads to this really key idea, violence of closure. It's a fancy term for something simple. When we only focus on the direct, physical act, we close our minds to everything that led up to it. We ignore the political and economic systems that create the conditions for violence to happen in the first place. There's this idea that language literally shapes our reality. Think about it. Before we had a common term like gaslighting, it was much harder for people to identify and talk about that specific kind of abuse. It's the same thing with violence. If our words for it are limited, our ability to even see it, let alone fight it, is also limited.
So let's expand our vocabulary. Let's learn the names for these unseen forces. We're going to break down 3 specific types of violence that are happening all around us, just below the surface. First up on our list is something called cognitive violence. And just like it sounds, this is a kind of violence that takes place in our minds, in the world of ideas. So what is it? Well, cognitive violence is what happens when one group's way of seeing the world is pushed as the only valid, rational, or correct way. This automatically frames other ways of thinking, like traditional or indigenous knowledge, as being backward or unscientific. It basically denies their value and silences them.
And you see this all the time. Think about ads for skin lightening creams. They aren't just selling a lotion, they're selling an idea. An idea that lighter skin is better, that it leads to success. That's a form of cognitive violence because it imposes one narrow standard of beauty as superior, devaluing everyone else.
Okay, so let's build on that. If cognitive violence is about imposing a way of thinking, our next one, epistemic violence, is about attacking a way of knowing. This one's a bit different. It's not just about saying, my worldview is better. It's about saying, your way of knowing things isn't even real knowledge. It's the act of completely invalidating a group's experience and their ability to speak for themselves, in their own words. It's a profound form of silencing. A really powerful example of this happens in healthcare. It's sometimes called obstetric violence, and it's when a person giving birth has their own deep bodily knowledge of what's happening dismissed in favor of rigid technical procedures. Their way of knowing is silenced. Or think about colonial education systems that were explicitly designed to devalue local knowledge and create a class of people who only valued the colonizer's way of knowing.
And that brings us to our third and final form for today, ontological violence. And this one cuts to the very core of a person's being.
Yeah, ontological violence is about as deep as it gets. It's not an attack on what you think or what you know. It's an attack on who you are. It's the violence of putting people in boxes, of labeling entire groups as savage or uncivilized, and in doing so, denying their fundamental humanity. Colonialism is the classic example here. By creating a category like savage, colonizers could justify unbelievable physical violence. It wasn't just name-calling. It was a tool that turned complex human beings into simple objects that could be controlled or even destroyed. It's a complete denial of another person's being. Okay, so now we have the words for these different kinds of violence, but let's connect them to the bigger picture. Why are these invisible forms of harm so widespread? What's the engine that drives them?
Well, what is that engine? The source material we're looking at points a finger at one powerful ideology: neoliberalism. It makes the really bold claim that this whole economic system, the one that puts markets and profits above all else, is itself a structure that creates these widespread, normalized forms of harm. And here's how that works, especially when it comes to our health. The system pushes this idea of hyper-individualism. So a huge public health issue, instead of being seen as a social problem, gets twisted into a story about a bunch of people making bad choices. We end up blaming individuals for their lifestyle instead of tackling the poverty or pollution that actually makes them sick. The real violence, the structural violence, becomes totally invisible.
So, after all that, the big question is, what can we actually do? It's one thing to have the words for these problems, but how do we start to notice them and, actually push back?
Here are a few things that literally anyone can start doing right away. Start questioning the ads you see. Who is being held up as the ideal and who's being left out? Pay attention to language. When you hear a systemic problem like bad roads being blamed on a single reckless driver, maybe question that narrative. Challenge those lazy stereotypes. And maybe most important of all, make an effort to truly listen to and amplify the voices of people who are usually ignored. And for those of you working in healthcare, this is even more critical. Try to look beyond the individual patient's behavior and see the world they live in. Respect that they are the ultimate expert on their own body. Understand that when you only focus on what a patient can control, you might be ignoring the massive structural forces they can't. And ask the tough questions about how the pressures of profit and efficiency might actually be causing harm in a system that's supposed to heal. So, we'll leave you with this question to carry with you. Now that you have the language for it, start looking in the news, at your job, just in conversations with friends. What invisible violence did you see around you today? Because once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And that, right there, is the very first step toward making a change.
Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.